Briefly then, to give you kind of some context with what conversation analysis is as a method of analysis. So it's a systematic analysis of talk. Essentially, conversation analysis breaks down talk turn by turn and considers utterances within interaction as having a function in achieving something in the interaction. So in this sense, we were looking at the function of requests and what they allowed to kind of be achieved in terms of medical tasks. And it looks at the sequential organisation of interactions. So typically when we're speaking, we take turns to speak and we try and minimise overlap between one another. So conversation analysis allowed us to kind of look at this naturally occurring data and break down the interaction to see how medical tasks were achieved. So to give you a summary of the findings, the extended requests can be broken down into kind of two aspects, which were the initial request and the fulfilment of that request. The initial request was found to be predominantly initiated by the specialist speech language therapist for a medical task. And the initial requests themselves projected a course of action, so it informed the patient and general speech language therapist of what tasks were to be undertaken in order to fulfill that medical tasks. Interestingly as well, the initial requests were framed as a collaborative endeavour through the use of the plural pronoun we. So in a lot of instances, as I'll go on to demonstrate, the specialist speech language therapist, though not actually being able to fulfil her own request due to things like the lack of physical proximity, still framed the request as a collaborative endeavour through the use of we. The fulfilment of the request itself then was taken up by the general speech language therapist and the patient, and the general speech language therapist was found to play an integral role in actually fulfilling medical tasks. So the key findings from the actual research itself concerns framing the initial request as a collaborative endeavour and the idea that this can actually facilitate a relationship-centred approach to care. Another key finding from this concerns the role of the general speech language therapist in actually being integral in fulfilling requests and medical tasks with the patient themselves. So this kind of gives you a breakdown in terms of the structure of the extended requests themselves. So we have the initial request from the specialist speech language therapist and the fulfilment of the request itself. So the initial request projecting the course of action, informing the kind of recipients of what is to be done in actually to fulfill that medical task. We've got the initial request which was framed as a collaborative endeavour through the plural pronoun we. One of the things that also came out was that the initial request was actually designed with embodied actions to try and provide additional information to the recipients and also elicit the preferred response in relation to the requested action. One of the facets with the initial request from the specialist speech language therapist also concerned the general speech language therapist playing an integral role in clarifying initial request components, and we'll go on to look at an example of where this occurs. From the initial request then, the fulfilment of the actual request itself, as I mentioned, was undertaken by the general speech language therapist and patient. And there were two ways in which the recipients responded to this, and this was either through the acceptance to the request, which oriented to the actual undertaking of it and the subsequent fulfilment of it, or launching into the immediate fulfilment of the request itself. At this stage as well, you've got this idea of actions of incipient fulfilment. What these basically are, they refer to kind of preparatory actions. So, for example, if the specialist speech language therapist wanted to observe the patient stretching her jaw or their jaw, you could observe the general speech language therapist, for example, taking preparatory actions through obtaining the equipment, for example, in this case, a Therabite, which is a piece of equipment which is used to stretch the patient's jaw. Another example could be the taking a measurement of the patient's mouth opening, whereby the general speech language therapist would obtain a measurer to take that. And these actions demonstrate the actual undertaking and fulfilment of the request itself. In the actual fulfilment of the request itself as well, then the general speech language therapist plays an integral role in actually fulfilling the request itself through their embodied actions. So through actually standing up, taking the measurer and actually measuring the patient's mouth, which the specialist is unable to do due to the use of telemedicine. So in terms of the way these are structured then, the specialist speech language therapist is initiating the requests themselves, and the fulfilment of these requests is then taken up by the general. So with this example then, what we have is the initial request from the specialist speech language therapist. So, okay, it might be worth it once you've had a drink just to see how you feel keeping the hold for 30 seconds. At this point then the specialist actually addresses a possible contingency in fulfilling that request, which is, it's quite a long hold. So she herself acknowledges that there could be difficulty in actually fulfilling the request itself. In line 8, the patient kind of aligns herself with this and does acknowledge that as well, that it's a bit long that, isn't it? Yeah. The specialist speech language therapist at line 10 then, yeah, it's quite a long 30 seconds. Maybe should we just try that once just to see if you can hold that comfortably? So even with this kind of possible contingency in fulfilment, the specialist speech language therapist kind of suggests that they continue with the actual medical task in order to attempt to fulfill that. One of the interesting things about this kind of short demonstration as well is the actual patient clarifying. Rather than clarifying with the specialist speech language therapist who had uttered the initial request, she kind of turns her gaze and reorients to the general speech language therapist sitting next to her and gets her to clarify. So line 19, there's what we call an apology token, so sorry, demonstrating kind of a lack of understanding and seeking clarification. And at line 20, the general speech language therapist reiterates the initial request and clarifies for the patient. And what was cut off, unfortunately, but at line 23, towards the end of her request, the patient kind of agrees with this and aligns with that. So through aligning with this initial request and the general speech language therapist clarifying that, the subsequent fulfilment of the request can then follow. So with this one then, what is unfortunately cut off is the switching pronouns at the end. So right, what about the drinks then? Shall we see? We've got it. Are you willing to have a try with us? It could be messy. We don't mind. Well, I don't mind. So towards the end of this segment then, the specialist speech language therapist actually switches from this use of we as a plural pronoun to the use of I. This kind of actually brings the technology back into the interaction, because what she's kind of acknowledging then is the fact that it could be messy. She then frames it as everyone, we don't mind, so the healthcare professionals in that situation, and then switches to the singular plural pronoun, I don't mind. So this kind of reminds us of the fact that, well, she wouldn't mind because she's not necessarily present physically with the patient and general speech language therapist, so this wouldn't necessarily be problematic for her. So we've got this kind of switching pronouns here. And if you see in line 1 as well, shall we see we've got it. So there's this use of the plural pronoun then to frame this as a collaborative endeavour between all the individuals involved. The final example that I'd like to show you is the integral role of the general speech language therapist in actually fulfilling the requests themselves. So towards the end of this near 2.5, so the general speech language therapist at that point does utter the actual measurement of the patient's mouth opening. So what you've got during this extract then is the integral role of the general speech language therapist in actually fulfilling the request itself through physically standing up and taking the patient's mouth opening measurement, which the specialist speech language therapist, because of the use of the telemedicine and the lack of physical proximity, would be unable to achieve herself. So in face-to-face consultations then, this wouldn't necessarily be problematic, given that there would be that physical proximity, so the specialist would then be able to kind of enact that herself. However, the healthcare professionals in this example then are then compensating for the restrictions of the telemedicine equipment and managing it between them. So they kind of each assume different roles in the specialist speech language therapist kind of orchestrating what is to be done, and the general speech language therapist then kind of enacting that and fulfilling the request itself. One of the things to notice about this extract as well is we've got the general speech language therapist kind of declaring that there's a problem in actually fulfilling the request itself, which at line 33, it's hard to see with the top end. And the specialist does align herself with this, kind of demonstrating, I know it is tricky. So even when kind of difficulty does become an aspect in the consultations or within the actual fulfilment of medical tasks, this is kind of acknowledged, and yet the actual medical task itself kind of proceeds and it is fulfilled at line 40 when the measurement of the mouth opening is kind of obtained. So this extract kind of shows the entire kind of extended request sequence, the actual fulfilment of it itself at line 40 when the measurement is provided. So those were just kind of a few examples of the ways that in telemedicine, speech and language therapy consultations, the kind of restrictions that occur due to the telemedicine video conferencing itself are kind of managed. And telemedicine itself presents individuals with kind of novel organisational and kind of situational dilemmas which are likely to be resolved through collaborative work. And Pappas and Seal 2010 looked at kind of the collaborative achievement of medical tasks in telecardiology and televascular consultations. And they found kind of similar findings in that the actual role of the nurse in those situations was heightened, and they were required to actually do more in terms of fulfilling medical tasks within physical examinations. They also found that the specialist lost a degree of control in actually fulfilling those tasks, as kind of was demonstrated here, due to the telemedicine and the kind of restrictions it does in place, and how these are managed between the healthcare professionals in that situation. With this as well, through adopting the use of the plural pronoun we, this can help facilitate, or it's argued that this can help facilitate a relationship-centred approach to care, and can be kind of crucial in advocating that with patients and hopefully increasing kind of patient satisfaction and empowerment to undertake medical tasks. So in the context of telemedicine speech-language therapy consultations, the general speech-language therapist becomes a critical intermediary in actually fulfilling the tasks themselves, and these are managed and kind of negotiated between the specialist and the general to make sure that the achievement of medical tasks with the patient does occur. So the findings from this research have tried to kind of inform aspects of how medical tasks are achieved when undergoing physical examinations in telemedicine speech and language therapy consultations. And there is kind of this desire, especially on my part, to kind of further this research, to kind of build on kind of a lack of literature regarding interaction when using telemedicine. Face-to-face kind of consultations and literature around interaction during this setting has kind of received a lot of attention. And Henry et al. Talk about the fact that there is a lack of kind of what is best practice when kind of undertaking interaction and how to manage interaction with telemedicine consultations. So the next steps from this research are to kind of further consider the role of interaction when using telemedicine and the differences and how this kind of compares to face-to-face interactions as well, to further bring out the novel challenges that healthcare professionals are kind of presented with and how they manage and overcome these to further inform kind of best practice and policy.